moderator, Kristen Burgess, and our speakers, Rodgers, Dr. Mourssi Alfash, Linda Wolford, and Andrea Imhoff. We're really excited that you could join us today. I hope you enjoy the Lunch and Learn presentation. Have a great day.
Welcome to the Ability event panel discussion of the day. We are talking about advocacy in Minnesota today. And so I'm going to let my panelists introduce themselves. I'm your moderator. I'm Kristen Burgess. I'm the director for the Center for Accessibility Resources at Metropolitan State University. I am a white female. My preferred pronouns are she, her, and hers. I have dark red hair pulled up into a messy bun and have my headset on, as well as a black and gray print dress. The background behind me is computer screens, and there is a fish tank off to my side. So at this point, I'm going to ask Mohamed to introduce himself and share some information with you all.
Hello, my name is Mohamed Alfash, and I'm a proud member of the community of Minnesota with disabilities. I grew up in Egypt and moved to Minnesota in 1996. I'm speaking from home, and I'm wearing a University of Minnesota t-shirt and a cap. And I'm a long-time dedicated public servant, disability advocate, and a social and organizational justice activist with a focus on equity for people with disabilities, new immigrants, race minority group, and low-income families from all backgrounds. One of my main goals and everyday activities is to contribute to improving the life of Minnesotans with disabilities and their families, and ensuring they have equitable access to all life needs to include employment, health coverage, and education, as well as to have entitlement to community integration, economic independence, and the ability to plan and live their life freely with no barrier.
Thank you, Mohamed. I'm next going to go to Andrea Imhoff.
Hi, Kristen. Thanks for the invitation to participate. My name is Andrea Imhoff. I'm a white woman in my mid-30s with autism, and I am wearing my navy blue suit and a blue striped shirt. I completed a master's degree prior to joining the civil sector here in Minnesota. Right now I work as a business systems analyst where I write code in multiple programming languages to write data reports and to help leaders make decisions. And I experience some privilege in my day-to-day with disability in that both my profession and my education mask my disability, where working in a business side IT role, it's absolutely expected that I ask a lot of questions, seek feedback, and have a penchant for optimizing systems.
Thanks, Andrea. Next, we're going to go to Linda Wolford.
Hi, everybody. My name is Linda Wolford, and I work at the Department of Human Services as an interagency coordinator in the Disability Services Division on the Community Capacity Positive Behavior Supports team. I've been there for about 3.5 years. I'm a white female. I'm 57 years old right now, the elder probably here, and I have brownish blonde hair highlighted that I use. I had my PCA curled for me before this. It's usually otherwise straight with some long earrings, and I'm wearing a periwinkle shirt with a little lace on top. And in my background, there's my messy closet with all my coats hanging on it and capes, and a really nice picture that, like, you can't read it, I can't read it, but it's got a great saying of a woman actually with a disability that wrote out a song for me that a friend of mine gave to me as a gift. So I have been a long-time disability activist. I use a power wheelchair, and I will get into more of what I've done, but I've worked mostly in education settings in the public sector and nonprofit world, doing various jobs after I completed a master's degree from St. Cloud State University in counseling psychology with a rehabilitation emphasis. and I prefer she, her pronouns.
Thanks, Linda. We also have Ken Rodgers with us. Ken, if you would introduce yourself and give us a brief description for those that aren't able to view the screen.
Hi, my name is Ken Rodgers. I use pronouns he, him, his. I currently am employed at the Department of Transportation, Minnesota Department of Transportation. I'm the ADA Title I coordinator, provide reasonable accommodations for employees throughout the state that work for the department. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. All right, panelists, let's just jump right into this and get to our first question. So this goes one of two ways depending on when your disability came into your life. So at what point in your life did you acquire your disability? Or at what point in your life did you come to understand that you are a person with a disability and really grasp that identity? Mohamed, let's start with you.
Okay. I have had a disability nearly all my life, and it happened when I fell off the roof of my family's four-story building when I was 5 years old. That was when signs of disability began to occur. However, my family and doctors thought that my hearing loss and speech impairment were temporary medical conditions that will improve as I grow up, but it turned to be permanent. I was not recognized as a person with disabilities in my early years to the extent that I served in the Army after graduating from college. During my 1.5 years of Army service, I started to realize that I do have severe permanent disabilities, and it was when I started to make adjustments to my future plan, knowing that fact. My disability was a major factor on deciding to immigrate to the United States, to seek treatment, and to also continue my graduate studies. So there was no treatment to help cure my disabilities. I have always been optimistic, and I proudly succeeded in my graduate studies, earning several graduate degrees besides having a great career. I had a goal to turn my disability into a motivating concept rather than being a barrier, and I pledged not to let my disability stop me from being who I want to be or doing what I would like to do. It is hard, but it is still not impossible. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Andrea? Would you like me to repeat the question, or are you good?
I'm good, thank you.
Okay.
So I'd like to tell a few stories, actually. In graduate school, I sat in the front hall of the lecture halls, and I was often the only student asking questions. Some people would thank me after class, even the professors, but it never really struck me as odd. I thought, I'm paying to be here. Why not? But in a previous job, a political appointee had come to a meeting to ask for some materials as a data request. And as a new hire at the time, I asked all the standard analyst questions. I walked out of the meeting thinking, I nailed it. I learned in my check-in with my then manager a few days after that she had tried to signal to me not once, but 3 times to stop. I felt some embarrassment sort of well up, and that was embarrassment that had been building over a young adult life at the time of not knowing the rules and feeling anxious about not knowing what other people knew. And so by the time I got the diagnosis of autism, it more or less confirmed what I already knew. I feel a lot of pressure right now inside to tell a story that's really positive so that my sadness isn't mistaken for shame. But living with a non-apparent disability does come with some of its own challenges. And it motivates me to ask, how do I make room for myself in a way that's respectful for myself and others? Thank you.
Awesome questions. Linda, you're next.
Okay. Well, as the elder, and also I have a condition called spinal muscular atrophy, and it's a progressive disability. And my mom told me that she noticed when I was 9 months old that I wasn't holding my head up like my older brother was. I was the second born. And so I got an official diagnosis at age 2, and that was when I wasn't walking. So I've never walked. And I got my first wheelchair, which was not a power wheelchair, it was a manual wheelchair at age 5, and grew up with a lot of medical, like the medical line. I saw a lot of doctors. They poked me with a lot of needles. They studied me a lot because I went to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester. And so I guess I always knew I had a disability and I was different, and I was taught at home until 8th grade. I used to have a tutor come out twice a week. I wasn't what you'd call homeschooled because my parents weren't schooling me. The school district, I grew up in rural Minnesota on a farm, sent people out to teach me, or a person, a couple times a week because I was in a small town and it was not accessible, my school. And so in 9th grade, I finally went to high school and with my peers, and I still had a manual wheelchair, thank God, because they carried me literally up the stairs of my school, up and down for between classes, because my high school was 3 levels high. So the guys in my class would get out 5 minutes early from class to take me to my next class if I had to be carried. So I think that my self-actualization of realizing what being a person with a disability meant was when I was in college. I started to read a periodical called The Disability Rag, and read about what oppression was, and meaning how other people with disabilities were struggling, like with transportation, with personal care assistance. And that was when the light bulb went off that, wow, this isn't something that I should try to be fitting in and seeming as much as non-disabled as I could, but really that I was part of something that I could feel proud about, and that the problems I experienced weren't so much about my disability, but about how society treated people with disabilities. So that was my awakening about being a person with a disability, even though I would go to summer camps since the time I was, I think, 10 years old, and with all kids with disabilities, because there wasn't many in my school, maybe some more people with non-apparent conditions, one with an apparent disability, because of course it wasn't accessible. And I loved being at camp. And there's now, I know right now, the documentary Crip Camp is very popular. And I can really relate to that because that was the first time I went and felt like being disabled was normal. And so that was a really big thing for me.
Awesome. Thank you. We'll turn it over to Ken.
Okay. So I became a person with a disability in my adulthood. It was in my 30s. I was mid-30-ish. I was a registered nurse, cardiac nurse at Abbott Northwestern, loving life and just living my life, and discovered that I had a retinal eye condition that was going to leave me blind in a year, as there was no treatment, and it was progressive. And that's exactly what happened. Within a year, I lost my sight. I lost my ability to do my current job, being an RN, a cardiac nurse in a hospital. At that point, I did not consider myself a person with a disability. I was just without sight. It took me a while to get some regrounding, but eventually a friend of mine turned me on to vocational rehabilitation, and I was introduced to vision loss resources, where I attended what I called blind school, where I learned how to live in the world as a blind individual and remain safe and independent. Even when I was in blind school, I didn't consider myself a person with a disability at that point. I was just a person that was going to a school that needed that kind of education, right? Grasping the term of being a person with a disability for me was a process. And thank goodness part of the curriculum at that school I attended required us to be a part of a support group. Of course, they realized that having acquired a disability sometimes is a process, and one needs to be guided to that next phase. And that's what that support group did for me. It took about 6 months, but before long, I started feeling much more comfortable being around other people that were experiencing the same thing as I was. And that's when I came to really start to understand that I was a person with a disability. It took a while, but again, that process, it's just kind of one of those natural processes that for me, it took almost a year to really get to that point. So, yeah.
All right, and our second question is, what part or parts of the Americans with Disabilities Act do you find to be the most impactful in your lived experiences? I think I'm going to reverse things up here, and I'm going to start with Linda.
Okay. And that again was what part? Can you repeat it one more time?
What part or parts of the ADA do you find to be the most impactful in your lived experiences?
Okay. Yeah. Well, because I have a physical disability and use a power wheelchair to get around, obviously the physical parts of it, meaning curb cuts, elevators, parking spaces, those things really help me be able to get around in society. Public transportation becoming accessible, that really helped me to get around. I've worked almost my entire life, which is surprising, but I've needed accommodations, particularly later in life, I've needed more accommodations. So that part of the ADA, Title I, for accommodations was really helpful. The other ones I described are in Title III, where public entities are, to be made accessible. So I would say that those things for me, as well as working for public and like the government, as I do now, and in higher education, where I also spent like 20 years of my career at the University of Minnesota. Then Title II, which applies to public entities, was really important to me, as well as the people that I served. So those are the major ones I would say for myself.
Thanks, Linda. And I'm going to have Andrea answer here, if she would.
I know what it's like to study and to work without accommodations in place. And I know what it's like to study and to work without disclosure of my disability. I spend too much effort trying to achieve as proof that I'm not too disabled. But who am I trying to prove that to, and to what ends? Achievement, in my experience, is a really poor substitute for self-acceptance. I still need to get better at stating my needs as reasonable expectations rather than requests in the Minnesota speak of, could we maybe possibly consider? As I practice that skill, I rely on the ADA requirement for reasonable accommodation coupled with strengths-based disclosure. The successes I've had using that approach have really changed my experience from feeling disabled to more like living with a disability. And when I can do that effectively, my problem-solving strategies get integrated into how I do the work, and they become trusted strategies. And I think that's really some of the ways that I experience privilege in my profession, and that I get to make up how the work is accomplished.
Thanks, Andrea. Mohamed, would you answer that question?
The part of the ADA that I found to be the most impactful in my lived experience is employment. And I do believe that the most important for people with disabilities and their families is to be employed. I am also a supporter of the employment first movement. Employment is a key for an improved quality of life, community integration, economic independence, independent living, less dependency on public assistance, and a better economy with higher GDP. We need to educate the policymakers and employers about the importance of hiring people with disabilities and to eliminate the long-standing stereotype that people with disabilities cannot or do not want to work. Studies found that while nearly 70% of people with disabilities are not working, between 70 to 80% of these individuals want and are ready to work, provided that they are granted the opportunity and that barriers are removed. When I talk about employment first, I mean it from both the quantitative and the qualitative perspective. So we want to see barriers removed and allowing people with disabilities to find employment, while we also pay great attention to the quality of employment for people with disabilities. We hope to see employed people with disabilities getting a job of their dreams, receiving the adequate accommodation that helps them perform their job successfully, and not being underemployed, underpaid, working below their competency, or being overlooked on career growth and development opportunities. Thank you.
Thanks, Mohamed. Ken, you're up next for the ADA question.
Can you repeat the question again?
Certainly can. What part or parts of the ADA do you find to be the most impactful in your lived experiences?
So a very interesting question for me. Personally, I think all of the components of the ADA are very impactful in my life. At different parts of my life, I've relied on different titles, more importantly than others. So initially, when I became an individual with a disability and blind, going to school and retraining for job prospects, I heavily relied on Title III public accommodations, ensuring that my documents were accessible for me. That also at some point became important in Title II, state and local governments, even though the schools that I were attending were specialized schools, they still were quasi-covered under the state and local government provision of anti-discrimination. So I found that to be helpful for me. But in the latter years of my life, truly the title that has been most impactful to me is Title I, employment-related accommodations. That's the whole premise for the work I do today. I find the ability for me to be able to work with employees that have newly acquired a disability or an injury that now qualifies as a disability. They come to me for consult and they think they're going to lose their job because of their disability or their newfounded disability. And I get to problem solve with them and find creative ways to implement accommodations that allow them to be able to continue to do their jobs. So in most cases, I find the power of Title I to be the most important and impactful for the work that I do every day. And I wouldn't be able to do this work if it weren't for the accommodations that I receive as an employed person with a disability to begin with.
Thank you. Certainly a trend there amongst all of you that the Title I is definitely a really important piece, although all the titles within ADA are certainly important and intertwined with one another. I think we can hopefully all agree on that. All right, question number 3 is starting to delve into your advocacy work. And so what I'd like to hear from you each is what drew you into disability advocacy arenas? And let's start with Linda.
Okay, probably the elder in the group. I don't know. Can't even, I'm not sure. I just close my eyes. I'm 57. So, but
oh, you're close. Not the elder.
Okay. Oh no. Okay. Well, I don't know. Anyway, but I've been the elder and I've had my disability probably longer than you. So in that respect, what drew me into it was seeing injustice. I think was recognizing that people with disabilities including myself, but others around me, were treated differently because we were, as other groups, there was something, that thing about of our identity as a person with a disability, we were treated in a disparate way, which prevented us from sometimes being successful. One of my first jobs was working at the Council on Disabilities, the Minnesota Council on Disability, where people needed information. And one of the things they would call me about is kind of what Andrea referred to as people with non-apparent conditions saying, you know, until I disclosed my disability, everybody treated me the same way, but then when I disclosed, suddenly nobody wants to talk to me. So realizing the pain that caused people in their lives, and also when you experience discrimination. My first job interview I went to was at Sears. I can say it because I think they're out of business now. And I went into an interview and I did really well. And then they said you had to do the Sears test. And I went in with another woman who I was flying through the test, like flying through it. She was struggling. And then I saw the supervisor, the woman interviewing me, take her back to another room and talk to her. And I knew at that point I wasn't going to get hired, because even though it was obvious I was successful in flying through that test and, you know, excelling on it, I didn't get hired. So it was at that point I realized that I was going to have to fight for equality. I did not file a lawsuit because back then there wasn't the ADA. There was no ADA in existence. But I was part of it. I'm going to just tell one more story because there's a lot of stuff I can talk about having experience, but that was the Metro. I was part of the class action Metro Mobility lawsuit that took place, and that, I'm trying to think of the year, somewhere in the mid-90s, I think, in which Metro Mobility literally came to a halt with people waiting, myself included. I was relying on that to get to work. We would wait 4 hours for a ride. We might be toured around. The bus might never come. And so that's when I learned about a class action lawsuit on behalf of people with disabilities, because we couldn't get to work. People couldn't get to medical appointments. They couldn't go shopping. They couldn't do anything. And the National Guard was called in to drive Metro Mobility buses. And so, and I learned a lot in that experience about fighting for the rights of people with disabilities and what that takes. And sometimes it's speaking out for those who can't speak for themselves. And so when I see injustice, and now I've my whole life also been involved in work of other marginalized groups, GLBT, people of color, and worked in jobs that embrace diversity, including disability. When I saw injustice, I realized that I needed to speak up about it in order for it to not have people be treated differently because of their differences. And so that's really how I got into the work of not just disability advocacy, but advocacy for underrepresented groups or groups that were discriminated against in our society and are still being discriminated against in our society.
Awesome. Thanks for your groundbreaking work, Linda. I'm going to bounce us to the other end of the spectrum and go to Andrea, who is newer to her advocacy role.
After I experienced employment discrimination, my fellow panelist, Mohamed, encouraged me to talk with reporters, and when the opportunity came along to participate in a subcommittee hearing to the Health and Human Services. Oh, I wish I could re-say that. Mohamed encouraged me to participate in a hearing convened by the Minnesota legislature in the Health and Human Services subcommittee.
All right, Mohamed, would you like to share with us how you got into the advocacy arena?
What drew me into the disability advocacy arena was that I, as an individual with severe disabilities and as a new immigrant from the Middle East, have had the first-hand experience with the barrier and isolation that people with disabilities are exposed to. And I felt and continue to feel and understand how disabilities impact nearly all life aspects of the individual with disabilities and their families. I witnessed the lack of employment, exposure to poverty, low education attainment, inequitable access to health coverage and housing, and low accessibility to many other resources and life needs. I also witnessed how disability and poverty go hand in hand and play a dual role as a cause and effect. So disability leads to poverty and poverty leads to disability. It was also determined that people with disabilities struggle more when they belong to another minority group. And I witnessed that disability and race minority cause double whammy. As a well-educated individual with several graduate degrees, a critical thinker with knowledge of the system and public policy, and a strong aptitude toward equity, I decided to speak up for myself first. Then I moved to advocate for others who cannot speak up for themselves. I continued to reflect on my competencies and on the rediscovery of my true north. And that was how I landed on being a dedicated public servant who loved and enjoyed advocating for underrepresented individuals and communities. And I determined that it is the arena where I want to spend the rest of my life and career. Thank you.
Ken, would you like to share with us your experience in entering the advocacy arena?
Sure. My entry into the advocacy arena was a little more nuanced. Being an individual that had not known disability and had a lot of privilege in the able-bodied world, so to speak, and then acquiring a disability and experience, as others have said, firsthand, examples of what I would classify as discriminatory things, barriers. I knew that in my skin, I was still the same person, right? I just now didn't have sight. So it was a hard lesson for me to understand, but time and time again, when you experience those types of things that happen to you over and over again, you realize that what the discrimination is being based on is your visual disability, my visual disability. One of the things I did when I graduated and became an independent blind person traveling safely in the environment and in my community, I looked for programs to go to, different types of employment opportunities, and I went to massage school. I learned massage and bodywork techniques to be a sports rehabilitative massage therapist. I figured, you know, that's a pretty tactile, hands-on kind of learning experience. And while it was, there was a tremendous amount of reading and print document that needed to be consumed. I had to fight to get my materials in a manner that I could read them and access them. And at that time I was using note takers and electronic devices and Braille output and Braille print, embossed documents. It was almost impossible for me to get my needs met, but I kept persevering because that's what I needed, that information. Eventually, I realized that I was getting what I needed, albeit a lot of work to do it. And I was realizing that the next person that came along that needed the same thing I needed was also going to have to advocate in the same manner. It wasn't going to be just a part of the process. And I realized that I didn't have the knowledge of how to really make systemic change. I could get the change that I needed by just being the squeaky wheel. But I wanted to have more of an impact. And I wanted to learn how to be more strategic about making change. That led me to look at different graduate programs, and I applied to several and was accepted to the Humphrey School of Public Policy. My education there was leadership and management skills, but I focused as a secondary degree disability policy, and it really introduced me to state legislature and how laws get made. It was through testifying on important things that were important to me at the time in legislative hearings that I learned the importance of advocating for beliefs. And I also learned that I had a unique perspective because I lived most of my life at that time as a sighted individual. I had perspectives from that world, but I also had perspective of a blind individual and the dilemma that caused. And I was able to articulate that in my testimony oftentimes, which gave it a lot of extra power. I decided, I came into advocacy after the era of protests, because originally, as I understand history, in order to get attention, people with disabilities had to really protest. They had to make a scene. They had to really be noticed to get their needs understood before they could even be attempted to be met. So there was this sense that in order to do anything, you really needed to be in someone's face to really get any progress. I learned, though, over time, it was a hard way to learn, but I learned over time that you could also get progress by helping people along the way to understand the perspective that you bring. And in sharing the dual perspective that I had of being a sighted individual and then being a non-sighted individual, I was able to relate better to individuals that had the power of persuasion, the power of the purse, the power of making laws and policies. And I learned through trial and error to be a better advocate by helping people along, because I truly don't believe people intend on purpose to be hurtful or to throw barriers up. They do it oftentimes without an awareness that that's what their actions are causing. So I find that it's most helpful to be a good advocate by helping people understand the perspective of what we deal with. We are experts in dealing with all of the varied barriers that we encounter. And we are also experts in being problem solvers because we have to solve those problems in order to continue. So when I'm able to share those things, it gives an openness to what point that I'm trying to advocate for. And that seems to be a really important key that I've discovered along the way that really helps me in my advocacy. I advocate every day of my life. There's someone somewhere that I'm always talking to, trying to share a perspective so that they can have a dual understanding and then hopefully also become an advocate. It's a never-ending job.
Very true. It definitely is. We are constantly in the role of educators, even those of you not working in the realm of education like some of us. But really important work that you all do, and important that people understand that sharing your stories can be the most impactful thing in creating that change, not only for yourselves, but for others as well. So I'm looking at the time, and we have one question left. And so I am going to choose the one. It's a little bit long in asking it, but it says, although the ADA is a landmark civil rights law, and we have made changes in the last 30 years, we know that we still have plenty of room for improvement. Where do you see yourself as an advocate in Minnesota as we move forward? Ken, you want to start?
Sure. This is a really easy one for me. Since I am a state employee and I work within the system, so to speak, of state government. I am keenly aware, as I work with individuals to help them acquire the reasonable accommodations they need to do their jobs, I've become keenly aware of the value that everyone brings to the workplace. Understanding also at the same time externally is a movement to create the workplace of state government to more closely align and match with the constituents that we serve. So our work population needs to mirror the population within Minnesota. We all understand that we use the statistic of there's about 20% of the population are people that identify living with a disability, and we are nowhere near a 20% percentage point of individuals that identify with a disability within state government as a workforce. So my personal advocacy right now is working very hard to ensure that programs get developed at the state level to embrace and to provide accommodations for people applying to different jobs that are available within the state. One of those programs is Connect 700. I am a very strong advocate of the Connect 700 program and have some very strong feelings about that program. I think that is a great way for people with disabilities to enter into state government. But they also need to be supported once they're in state government. And that's where my advocacy seems to be centered right now, is making sure that when we acquire people within state government that do identify as living with a disability, that they have the supports they need to be able to acquire all of the accommodations they need to be successful. That's an ongoing advocacy right now for me.
All right, awesome. I'm going to go out on a limb, but I think we might have a trend in your fellow panelists' answers on this question. So, Mohamed, I'm going to turn it over to you next.
Though the ADA is a landmark civil rights law that was implemented in 1990, we know we still have plenty of room for improvement. As an advocate for people with disabilities in Minnesota, and as we move forward to improve the mechanism and the outcome of the ADA, I would continue to focus on the employment dimension of the ADA. After 30 years from signing ADA into a law, it was determined that we have yet a lot to accomplish. According to the current population survey, CPS, by the U.S. Census Bureau, poverty among people with disabilities remains almost the same, and they are as well as poverty rate among people without disabilities. The findings also indicate that employment gap for people with disabilities in the U.S. and in Minnesota remains a critical issue that has been ongoing for generations, despite the many federal and state laws and the acts, including the ADA. According to reliable references, including the FCC, the employment number of people with disabilities have not increased in the year since the enactment of the ADA in 1990. People with disabilities in the U.S. and in Minnesota continue to be underrepresented in the workforce in both the public and private sector. And segregated employment remains permitted in Minnesota. We need to continue working on the improvement of ADA to overcome employment barrier and increase employment levels. Improve the workforce quality for workers with disabilities who are either underemployed, underpaid, working below their competencies, or are exposed to a high unemployment rate. We need new policies that are more employer-focused. We need also transforming from anti-discrimination policy into a more of affirmative action policy. We need to look into student loan repayment and forgiveness program for people with disabilities. We need an amendment to prohibit segregated employment in all states. We need a narrow tailoring strategy and a non-competitive hiring authority to help increase the number of people with disabilities in the labor force. We need more, larger, and continuous tax credit for employer hiring people with disabilities. And we also need to encourage employer and government to speak a common language. Thank you.
Common language, it's definitely a challenge. Linda, I'm going to toss it over to you because then you can, not that you're done being an advocate, but you can help pass that torch to Andrea. So.
Okay. And Andrea and I have met, and one of the things that I'm involved in an employee resource group at the Department of Human Services. I just gave up, we're the founding co-chairs, myself and Peter Berwaltis, who is also a graduate of the Humphrey Institute, just like Ken and Kristin here on this panel. And Ken, and so anyway, so one of the ways that I continue to advocate is to work monthly, and just had our meeting today, of employees at DHS that have disabilities, whether they be not a parent or a parent, and to make sure that people, that we get the support that we need, and pushing sometimes the envelope to make it a better place, and also to be heard by upper levels at DHS to make it a better place for people with disabilities to work. I also serve as a mentor for other employees with disabilities, and I would say I spend about 2 hours a week in which I get calls from individuals at DHS just to talk about experiences they're having, sharing experiences. So doing that and trying to help others learn what I've learned, or to learn from them about supporting each other. Also, I work in my job on the workforce shortage issue for supporting people to live in their homes as long as possible, people with disabilities, children, and that's a really major problem that many people are not aware of right now. And so even myself, I'm experiencing lots of stress this week because I'm looking for staff constantly so that I can stay living in my own home, and the support I need to do that. So I can't imagine that's going away anytime soon. Even though we have a high unemployment rate, it doesn't seem like it's helping to steer people our way because these jobs don't pay very well. And so that's a place of advocacy to try to, not only are people with disabilities devalued in this society, but the people who work with us also are devalued, particularly direct support professionals, so and PCAs. So that's an area that I'll continue to work on. And I'm going to name two more that I don't think people have talked about, and that would be networking with other. I don't think we've done a great job in the disability community of networking with like people of color and GLBT people to see what our common ground is, and looking at that intersectionality piece of I'm a white woman with privilege and educated, but have a significant disability, but what can we do to help see the connections that we have with other groups with other marginalized identities? And I have worked on that all my life and want to continue to do that, particularly in what's happening in society today with the police brutality. And they're not talking enough in my mind about the police brutality that's taking place for people particularly who have mental health issues or people of color with mental health issues, and police brutality there. And that's another topic of how that we could, bring into light. So trying to bring that into it. And then I have a dream that I'm going to talk about, that one day in my lifetime, if I survive COVID, is that something the ADA wouldn't touch is traveling, airline travel, because I think it's the one uncharted territory. Buses finally had to get lifts, even though they fought against it, to get people on buses, but airlines, not so much. It's really hard to travel when you are a person with a disability, especially using a mobility device like a power wheelchair, and the seats being too close together and they won't let you just bring your chair on and stay in your chair. So that's my dream, is that one day I will roll in my chair onto an airplane so that I can travel more, because the ADA created many opportunities to make things accessible once I get there. So I might find in a hotel room with a roll-in shower, but I got to get from point A to point B. And that airplane stands in the way right now of making it easy for me to be able to travel. And so that's my dream, is to try to figure out a way to go after the airlines to say, it's your time now to make it accessible for people with disabilities so that we can access air travel and stay in our chairs and be able to get on an airplane like other people and enjoy that, and not have it be an experience where you're carried on, where they break your chair. And so anyway, that's my dream.
All right, Linda, as a fellow chair user, you let me know how I can help you fulfill that dream, because I am right there with you. So,
I practice some attorney, so I'm not playing.
All right, so Andrea, if you would wrap this one up for us and let us know where you see yourself as an advocate in Minnesota as we move forward.
The disability rights movement mobilizes us around issues of choice, autonomy, and dignity. These values motivate me to make sure that I'm using my voice and my privilege responsibly. And like Linda talked about, I think we have an opportunity to make sure that we look at our own experience of disability from an intersectional perspective as we consider what civil rights would look like for whole people. And that by looking at civil rights for a whole person, that means that we get to embody valued social roles in our home, in our school, in our workplaces, and in our relationships. My current advocacy is around normalizing conversations about disability at work while I work on self-acceptance.
Very admirable work, and I love the discussion about intersectionality and also coalition building, right? We need to find those commonalities amongst all of us as just people. I want to thank all of you as panelists for joining us today and taking part in this discussion. I also want to thank our interpreters, and we will hopefully have a little bit of time for some live Q&A at the end of this, so we will tune in for that. Thank you so much. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our panel, and I just want to see if there are any questions out there. I have one that I can start with, although I don't see Ken. Perhaps Andrea has some thoughts on this, because I know she has been active in employment advocacy. So Andrea, if I may put this question to you. The question is, how can agencies empower their ADA coordinators to be as effective as Ken has been at Mndot?
Great question. Wow. Yes, Ken's been an awesome advocate from what I've heard about, and I would have loved to join an agency with him in the role of ADA coordinator. I think about my own journey of disability awareness and self-acceptance and how that needed to play out at work right away, given that I came to my diagnosis much later in life than childhood, which is typical for autism. And I think one of the immediate things that I had asked the ADA coordinator at the time was, is there any sort of affinity group or resource group? And that turned out to be the group that Linda mentioned in her talk. And getting to meet other adults with disabilities right away really helped me integrate my sense of myself as competent and able to do the work into my identity. Where I really needed the advocacy, though, of the ADA coordinator was in helping to educate my manager and also helping me to educate myself as I considered what are the opportunities and challenges with disclosure. And I think that's what I'd like to share today.
Is it okay if I say something, Kristen? Can you hear me? It's Linda.
Yes, go ahead, Linda.
This is something that's come up in our ERG about how, like the positions that can, and in our agency, Eric Falk hold, they are MAPE level positions, which are not managerial, at least in our state agencies. And I think that's pretty much true for most of them. So elevating that position, I think really needs to happen at this state, because they're dealing with managers and supervisors who are above them in the hierarchy of our structure. And so if we if we don't give them the power they need to, do their jobs to hold people accountable, then they don't have a lot of voice for pushing for the accommodations that they hear from employees. So I know that I think a movement to try to do that, to reclassify that position, is really necessary for that to take place, for people to get the accommodations they need. And also, I know in our agency, I think we have 2 people, and we have over, I don't know how many hundreds of employees with disabilities. That's just way too few staff to carry out their jobs. When I was at the University of Minnesota, we had about 6 or 7 staff people that worked on accommodations for employees, where at the state it's much fewer and you have much more responsibility for a lot more people. So I think that helping increase those numbers of people who implement accommodations and work on the interactive process is really critical to try to make sure that people get the accommodations they need.
Thank you, Linda. Very, very true sentiments. We are woefully understaffed in that particular area. I have another question from the Q&A. This person says, I have a son with autism and he often feels different from his peers. As a parent, this breaks my heart and I can't fix it for him. I often advocate for his needs and tell him he is perfect the way he is. Do you have any thoughts on what you wish your parents or peers knew during these difficult times to assist you? So Andrea, I believe that question is directed in your direction, although Linda, I know that you've also worked with folks and you may have some insight there as well. So I'm going to pass it to Andrea and let her answer.
Question came in, and since it was a bit personal, I took some time to reflect. I hope you don't mind if I read just a bit. So thank you so much for sharing with me your son's experience. I didn't grow up with the diagnosis, and so I really can't speak to what that was like, but I did talk about what it's like to grow up knowing you're different. And, my parents and my teachers just really thought I was shy. And they spent a lot of time trying to help draw me out of my shell and to help me sort of mitigate my awkward. But if I'm honest, in retrospect, I really actually needed people to help me lean into my difference and into my awkward, because that would give me the tools I needed to learn how I learn and how I'm able to connect. And for me, technology is such a strong personal interest. I was able to fold that into my professional life. And I feel really lucky that I'm able to do that. Thinking about childhood though, I think the same lesson might apply in that it would have been really helpful to find out how can I use my special interests to serve others and as a basis for connection. And that way it would have equipped me with a sense of competency and mastery and that sense of belonging around a valued role. I wish you the best of luck with your son.
All I had to add was you're doing the greatest thing you can by saying to to your child that they're great the way they are, because that's the best message you can send. And also I encourage parents. We hear a lot about segregation and wanting their kids to be around other, kids without disabilities. It's just as important to have them be around kids with disabilities, and please encourage them to do that. Just like people of color need to be around other people of color, we as people with disabilities need to be around people with disabilities in order to feel okay about ourselves.
Thank you both. Absolutely true. And we are out of time. I just want to remind everyone to join us tomorrow at 7:30 p.m. Central Standard Time for our last session on the U.S.-China Deaf Education Research Project. Thursday at noon, we're thrilled to have the Director of State Services for the Blind, Natasha Jerde, forgive me if I pronounced that wrong, and Director of Vocational Rehabilitation Services, Dee Torgerson. Finally, Friday, join us at 4:30 for our last Ability event session and gala event where Governor Walz and Senator Tom Harkin will have a discussion about what they are doing currently in the disability community, Governor Walz in particular, right here in Minnesota. Thanks for joining us, and please enjoy the rest of the events this week.